didn't want to call data because they manipulate it and they.
In one lie following this incident, do you think the legislature should investigate the agency to find out what they appear to be trying to hide?
Yeah.
Beyond legislature have tools to hold the WDFW accountable to people, and if so, what are those tools?
I'm not sure why we're really focused in on Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, because they're in the area where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife gives them direction as to what to do, because they're in federally, this was in the federally listed portion. So the state Fish and Wildlife is looking to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, you know, this is what we want to do, directors, policy, and the game commission's policies, and obviously laws that are set up that can.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Follow-up, commissioners, what would you like to do? There were a number of points talked about, certainly some suggestions of better performance and some protocols, I believe is the phrase often employed, put in place. How do you wish to communicate those in the form of a summary? Resolution, letter? One obvious point that would come to my mind is I would think the commissioners might want to reinforce the note that both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife recognize that the sheriff, and actually established through an administrative directive, the sheriff in the county is the chief law enforcement officer, and ultimately and initially responsible for public health and safety. I mean, something as simple as that should theoretically take some of the confusion out of the discussion. You heard yourself, or we call this, and then they call that, and they call this, and they call that, and someone else calls someone else. All well and wonderful if you have a wolf that chased a calf.
Right.
If you have a person in a tree, I'm not sure that's an effective law enforcement approach. And it might be just as simple as cutting that directive.
But I do think that we need to follow up with a letter to U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Absolutely.
Stating, hey, thank you for coming to this after action meeting, and this is what we expect to be the outcomes of this meeting.
I think it's a good idea to do that, to tell them what we understand the outcome is.
Yep.
So directed to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, CC to State Fish and Wildlife, in the sheriff's office?
In the sheriff's office?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't know, because see, if the same thing happens on that side of the river, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife are not gonna be called, it's gonna be the state. So I don't know if there should be two separate letters sent to them, CCing the sheriff's office, one to state and one to federal.
You know, it actually may be some advantage to separating from this viewpoint. And the chairman and I talked about this earlier, having testified on the management plan when it went in place. One of the criticism, skepticism, maybe a better word, expressed during all of those hearings was that, yeah, you're looking at a management plan, but are you gonna follow it? Are you gonna follow it? Are we going to be compensated? Are you going to respond, you know, when these conflicts, and everyone knew conflicts would eventually occur. It will eventually happen to whatever level, in whatever time period. That question posed over and over and over again, are you? And I would suggest there's at least some evidence to suggest they really haven't. They've avoided in many respects doing what the management plan actually specifically calls out for them to do. And I get that. You know, they have a program. They want the program to be successful.
Well, yeah, you're correct, Director, and I remember I testified, you know, right after they passed it. It was almost like the Pelosi deal, you know, we have to pass it so we can find out what's in it. And I testified, I said, you know, your plan's fatally flawed. from the beginning, there's no way that you're gonna disperse wolves over to the west side and on the Olympic Peninsula, besides they don't want them there. But the way that they laid that plan out, it's fatally flawed because you can't get the distribution, so they knew that the concentration of wolves were gonna be over on the side and they could outvote us. So, and whenever they run into problems, they move the goalposts. Like smack attack, you know? They run into problems, oh, that wasn't a depredation, oh, okay, this was a depredation, yeah, that, well, okay, we caught him in the end, well, we finally got to the point where we, after about 25 depredations, they got the 3 confirmed kills that they needed to do lethal control. Well, now, control again, then they say, oh no, that wolf was actually transient wolf from the Huckleberry attack.
If we address this issue with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, based on today's conversation with the letter, and then have a further conversation about our letter to Fish and Wildlife, and those points that you brought up, Jim, I would like to be able to have a conversation about, in light of what you're telling me. I need to be able to look at it a little bit more so that we should touch on the issue specifically, so the letter meets. The question you came up with was whether we should identify or make it known to them that they're not following the plan. We need to talk about some specifics that we agree with, that would be the things that we really hit on in that letter, so that it's not, just a general statement about you're not following the plan. I think we need a few areas where we have to identify those points. Examples.
You said, what Jim has said, there is truth in.
Right, and it would mean a lot more to me as commissioner to be in, and I know we have to trust what each other are saying about, well, and I would request that mutual trust with who I'm involved with more than you, and so I need to have a little bit more information about the items that I'd like to see in the letter. So if somebody said to me, "How do you do this?" They call you up and they say, "Well, Chris, you went on record saying this, Mr. Branch," and it's like, well, a few examples, I think then we're on good ground.
Yep,
And you might even, Perry, if you have that full knowledge and you wanna put that in a letter and then say, here's these circumstances, to me, that'd be fine. But I just wanna make sure that what goes into a letter, is something that I have a good handle on when I have to respond.
Understood,
But
you
I
have to
think
defend
that-
it.
I think that we're, really, the letters that we should be writing are in regards to
But I'm
that,
getting at there, yeah.
right? I mean,
And that's where I think a joint letter for the situation we're dealing with right now would be fine, because we can point out, we had some conversations with Fish and Wildlife folks here, and there tends to be a little bit higher level of trust there to some degree, and then Fish and Wildlife. And so, there's the sheriff's office, and so we have law enforcement, and I think one biologist, not a law enforcement person. It is the violator, if you will, of the communication in this situation.
And I guess, taking your comment to segue into, I guess, the point, the overarching point I would make, I appreciate what you're saying, this incident, certainly, the straw that broke the camel's back, or however you wanna say it, but I would suggest that unless you have one renegade who just completely disregarded policies from on high, which I don't think is the case, I think what you have is a lack of policies from on high. So you're kind of left as an individual, and I think you saw that, to quote what you think is useful information, the idea being, they're my wolves, leave them the hell alone, the incident's gone, she's at the airport, don't worry about it, we're done. You heard that from Ranger Reedy. It was a good outcome, why are we even here? It was kind of the cut and thrust of the discussion. Well, you make the same argument about the Carlton Complex fire. I mean, it got started, got put out, what's the problem? Okay, 300 houses got lost and 3 firefighters, but other than that, it was a good outcome. You
Well,
know,
you have
so-
to know in communications that, you find people get pretty compassionate about their work
Mhm.
and their response in
absolutely. So I guess the point I with your observation, sometimes the policies from on high go a long ways toward preventing that sort of thing from happening. And I'm not, and if there are policies in place that led him to do that, then we need policy. Or if there aren't any, if there's no real directive, it's an endangered species, therefore it's a law of the land, therefore you gotta do everything worldly possible to protect it. Well, if that's what people think, they need to fix that.
Well, and Donnie made a good point about how people react in situations when they face them right there. And there are those situations where you face a wild animal, and there's those situations where you face another person with different policies to deal with. And how you respond in that few minutes doesn't necessarily mean that was the policy from on high. That means that's the way you react.
Oh, no, fair enough, from time to time, so.
Nikki, did you have a question?
I'd like to ask you a few questions.
Pardon me?
Is it appropriate to?
Well, yes, we decided that we would open it up, and she's Farm Bureau president, so.
She is?
Yes.
Nicole.
I'm sorry, we haven't met before.
Point blank said, the woman biologist on the background of the phone call with Justin Troutman that was telling Justin Troutman not to go was Ellen. She is the local wolf biologist. Call data. That is who you go to. That is who you work with. So when you've got the local wolf biologist who is making a judgment call like that, that does not instill trust in the public that she's got our best interest in mind. Okay, so that never got teased all the way out. In fact, I didn't hear her name mentioned in that context. But I did talk to Dan Christensen just after you closed the public part of it today, and he did say that he is the supervisor of both Justin and Ellen, and he did not believe that it is his call. Christensen said, WDFW, that is not our jurisdiction to dispatch a search and rescue helicopter. We would not give an order to do that. Nor should we have given an order for it to stand down. It's not our place whatsoever. I asked the question, and I don't think the underlying thing that kept going through my mind is, was it because whoever ordered it has to pay for it? Right? We get into this jurisdictional stuff with fires all the time. Forest Service doesn't want to order in certain equipment because DNR wants to make the call because ultimately, who's going to pay for it, right? Budgets matter. You guys paid for this one, right? Search and rescue paid for this helicopter, or did DNR pay for it?
I have no idea.
Those are questions we need answered,
Right.
right? Because we just set precedent. And I just heard Dan Christensen say WDFW is not going to pay for search and rescue helicopters on every one of these that pops up. So these are things that need to be teased out. And then the other thing that I think you got really close to, Chris, was if we're trying to be proactive to prevent this from next time, what are the procedures and protocols that they have in place for communication? So, does Matt Marsh know? Does Ellen at WDFW talk to the Forest Service? We would assume she did, but we don't know. And if she did, we would assume it was their biologist, Matt Marsh, but again, we don't know. And if Matt Marsh knew from the Forest Service, did this little researcher gal know, or did her employer send her out into the workforce and put her in danger? That's a lawsuit waiting to happen, right? Reckless endangerment of her life. If her boss knew and didn't tell her she was going near a den site, she was 3 miles from a den site. They need to tell her that. They have an obligation to communicate that to their staff. They also have an obligation to communicate that to me as a cattle rancher on an allotment that is within a day's walk of there. I maintain that they should be communicating those things. There should be a chain of command, a policy and procedure for how wolf presence is communicated. And I never heard any of these guys answer that today. They never talked about their chain of communication. And to me, that's the key in preventing it from happening again.
So, I had a conversation with Donnie. He told me it was Ellen who was telling Justin that, hey, they're probably doing this. They probably don't need to send a helicopter. We can probably just get her down out of the tree and have her walk out, right? Okay, but my response to Donnie was, I don't care what any of those biologists, what those people think. It's what's going on in the head of the individual who made a call that says, I'm scared to death, I'm 30 foot up in a tree, I need help. Right? So, I mean, whether or not those people think that there's not a threat, it doesn't matter. That person thinks there's a threat. It's like me walking down the road and a guy comes along with a, hoodie over his face or whatever, walking along. Okay, well, so at what point do I feel threatened, and at what point is there going to be basically you can't have a biologist telling somebody that no, they're not going to get hurt, don't worry about it.
She shouldn't have been part of the call whatsoever.
No, it should have just been, hey, there's a person in a tree, send in the, help them. The one weird thing is that it was a DNR helicopter. Most of the time, our search and rescue is Navy helicopters. So, and the Navy works with our county for training. So we don't get billed a lot of the times for the search and rescue helicopters, which is nice. This is just, it was a totally weird situation to have it be a Forest Service employee that went directly through the Forest Service dispatch.
That's all. I just had those questions to feed you some more question ideas on things that still need to be teased out and how to prevent it in the
I
future.
appreciate that.
So that, I take my little boys 9 and 11 out into the forest 2-3 days a week. We don't want to stumble on a den site any more than the Forest Service scout does. So just how to bring things into the daylight, because they do operate in a veil of secrecy and treat us as though we shouldn't be trusted, right? We can't be trusted with that information, and so then it's natural for everyone to not trust each other.
And it doesn't get any better after that, so I
Right.
agree.
Mistrust gets met with mistrust. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Appreciate
Yep.
it.
Thank you.
I've got some ideas for some letters, Commissioners, so let me do some drafting, and then, you can take a look at them. You can do what you will with them. I think we really ought to move along a bit is 17A 400, where last we left off, you had made some amendments, the water availability study area, you had made some amendments to it. It went out for legal review. I believe Mr. Getchis has shared with you the results of that. If not, I have somewhere here copies of it. The main point I would make is, and of course, the legal review is in response to suggestions, if you will, made to Future Wise. And in your legal review, you kind of rolled them all into comments. The comments from Future Wise dealt with two issues. One, the recitals in the ordinance. The other, the actual suggested amendments to the code section itself. The amendments to the code section itself, most of them you did. There was one that the attorney drew attention to. Go ahead and go to the code itself. And it was the May shall. It started out as May, you went to shall, he suggested May. I mean, it's your
No,
code.
I agree with I'm gonna take the advice of the attorney.
Let's see now, we said that it was May, and we said we wanted it to be shall.
Yes.
And then he went back to May, and then he said, you should really look at this and have it be May.
Going down here, because so, water availability study overlay shall be adopted by the Board of Commissioners upon their finding the sufficient information is known to support the conclusion. Which, from my perspective, that's May in the way that whole thing's written, but shall works just fine. There's no reason that I can see to go back and forth over the issue. What I'm saying here is that a water availability study overlay shall be adopted, and I don't remember who brought this up, but by the Board of Commissioners findings that sufficient information is known to support the conclusion that inadequate water supplies exist to support additional density.
I'm guessing that flipped it was the second part of that. Or that insufficient information exists to support the approval of subdivision or other land use activities that require public water supply. While certainly a water availability study overlay may be an appropriate response to that, you can also just not
Deny.
approve.
Yeah.
Just deny
Yeah,
so.
it's true, okay.
So between the two, you know, and then when I come up the first time, the idea was, I threw in May because I always try to give the commissioners as much latitude as you can.
Yeah, I guess the only, looking at it and not caring whether who cares, or who supports what at this point, reading the language there, I think that there's part of it to me that says, if we find out that there's not adequate water, supplies, potable water, or that insufficient information exists for subdivisions, I mean, I would think that it would be incumbent on us to either deny it or the water availability study. Deny it, but we'll have to have a finding that.
However awkwardly I worded this,
Yes.
fair enough.
If you were at the whole last piece.
Well, the
shall
whole,
might be,
Right.
okay.
and this is actually, the last piece is a takeoff from language you find in other water codes, which essentially empowers DOE. If they know there's not enough water, they can close it to further withdrawal or appropriation. Or if they're not really sure there's enough water, they can do the same thing. They don't have to, but they can do the same thing. So that was kind of the target I was shooting at. If you know there isn't enough water, you need to look at it, figure out what's going on.
Or you know that there's insufficient information to make that decision.
If you don't really know, you still have the option of doing it, or there are other vehicles, you know.
Mine will work, May will work there, it'll work.
Okay.
I don't,
Good.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in terms of the recitals, go to the ordinance itself, if you would, please. And the overarching observation from FutureWise was, this is all laws already been on the books, and it takes kind of the tone that Watcom-Hearst suddenly changed all this stuff. To a point, there's a point in there. However, that said, I remind everybody that since 2002 in Campbell-Gwen, there's been a succession of court cases, and that pendulum has swung back and forth, keeping in mind that the Watcom-Hearst decision overturned the appeals court decision that actually upheld the approach that Whatcom County took. So it isn't as black and white as perhaps one would suggest. And then, of course, the bottom line, it matters, and this is not necessarily our legal brief, nor do I want it to be someone else's legal brief if they appeal us on something. So what I can do here, if the commissioners want, is to essentially simplify it to the key points. And you know, Whatcom-Hearst, I think, erased any doubt in terms of what the county's responsibilities are, at least in its broad strokes. 58-17-110, 1927-097, those different statutes that directed the county to make certain findings regarding potable water supply. What I can do is essentially just leave it to that, essentially cover the very basics of the authority that direct you to do what you are trying to get enough information to do through this process. So I wouldn't put in, my opinion, I wouldn't put in all of the suggestions from FutureWise, because I don't think it's that as perhaps they would have you believe. But in the end, it's up to you. They're your findings, they're your recitals.
so their suggestions, that's FutureWise, where they're pointing out some discrepancy in our compliance with the law.
Their main concern, let's scroll down so we see the top. So, I lead off, obviously, with Whatcom-Hearst. determined didn't require that. 5817-110 required that, 1927-097 required that.
Yeah.
What Watcom-Hearst did was say, county, you can't rely on DOE entirely to carry out your statutory obligation. So I mean, to that point, Tim has a point. That wasn't necessarily new law, but it was a different application and interpretation of existing law. Then, of course, we go down, and the rest of it's pretty much bread and butter. So, you know, I can homogenize the first part a little bit if you find his observations compelling.
I think his observation is compelling.
Hmm?
I mean, it's right. It was argued in that case, and actually, in essence, really counted the law, and it wasn't taken seriously. And so really, Watcom-Hearst just revealed that.
And say, I
I think you just, all you're gonna do though is change to the first whereas, right?
I change the first whereas and to his observation.
Yeah.
Because everything else in there.
Everything else is just pretty much
stating,
statement.
I think
We gotta do this.
that required part is.
I think that's what
just
hipped
that
him up.
word is.
That's what hipped him up.
Yeah.
And like I say, to a point, yes.
Yeah.
So, I can homogenize the first whereas, and I think probably get to the tone at least
Right.
of the criticisms. I think the rest of it, I don't think is a problem, but that's your call.
No, and it's true, because there's a lot of conversation around the state after Watcom-Hearst that it was something that somebody named Watkin or Hearst did to us. I mean, it was what they did to us, what the court did to us, and actually it was a decision that pointed out some things in the law that we all knew existed.
The distinction, in my opinion, the distinction with, the argument of Watcom County's determinations, which is relying on DOE help,
Pretty
you know,
much.
to do that.
Now, how did you do it?
You know, and so it's not, it's not really a disagreement that the 5817-110 says what it says, or 1927-197 says what it says, 3670, you know, says what it says. Say his point, and I can fix it. The point is Watcom-Hearst just brought it around. Okay, county, yeah, you know you have to do this, but you have to do it. You can't let someone else do it for you. It's kind of that.
Well, there was kind of becoming a sentence saying you have to determine whether or not there's water rights available. It was a standard letter that the college sent out.
So if the commissioners are okay with the rest of it, then I'll make some changes to the first whereas.
Not a big deal.
That work?
Good.
Let's go back to the code section now. I think you already gave me the green light. I'm sorry, go to the suggested amendment. I think you already gave me the green light, for this. Is my memory not good?
Yeah, the two-year review.
Is to get to the concern that it was too open-ended.
Yeah, I think that helps us probably in making sure that we don't find ourselves being challenged on a moratorium type.
Rolling moratorium.
Yeah.
The attorney looked at this and said there was no challenge with it. So, then with the change from shall back to may, we'll include this language, all massage the first recital in the ordinance. I can put it before you for adoption.
Yep.
That'll work? Okay.
That was the only thing that Tim had left to say about this? Okay.
Now, I'm assuming you got that input from Dave. It's my understanding you have.
Well, it's
Am
good.
I
Well,
not?
that's
Yeah, but he said that, no, we did, but most of it was,
So it was discussions about the recital.
yeah, just discussions about the recitals.
But I mean, I can go get that, if the commissioners aren't sure you've seen it.
I actually wasn't questioning you, Perry. I was somewhat joking
Oh,
about Tim's lengthy comments on a variety of things, and I just thought, okay, that was it?
that was it, Yeah, fair enough, okay. I just wanted to make sure you saw that
Yes.
input, because I occasionally think that, so.
But remember this, when you walk in this door and we've got a whole agenda full of things, and all of a sudden we're revisiting something, it's like, yeah, we'd like to be prepared, but some,
Been there, done that. Yeah, been there, done. So, okay, we'll put this, I'll put this language together, and I'll put it back in front of you. My opinion, where I asked, you have not made changes that are so extensive that it would constitute a need to set a new public hearing to revisit them or to remand to the planning commission, but that's your call.
you guys feel comfortable with that?
No,
It's fairly minor
It's
change.
benign, as far as changes go, I think we should just adopt it.
Okay, all right. Okay, quickly, we've set your public hearing for 17A290 and 17A220, that's your Cannabis Operations and District Use Chart Amendments, August 27th at 1:30. The changes, as we quickly discussed the other day, and we'll go ahead and get you those revised code sections and an draft adopting ordinance before your hearing for your review. R1 and I don't remember. Methow Review District, R1 and the Methow Review District went from permitted to a conditional use permit, and they included enforcement language, pretty much the same as 17A, your zone code. Those are the recommendations from the planning commission.
So, in reading through our nuisance codes, we don't have a light nuisance code. So remember when I was asking about, hey, did they come up with something as far as lighting goes?
Well, 17E290 has a section.
Okay, is it the same section though that was originally in it?
Originally, no, they added it somewhere through the course of it. It's the same language as in the interim controls.
Yeah, which.
Talks about down shielding,
That
lights.
just talks about down shielding light, that doesn't talk about light within a building casting a everlasting glow across the mountainside.
Well, theoretically, it has to be down shielded. If it's casting a glow, it's not down shielded, but fair enough.
This should be lighted building.
Yeah, so these guys are now starting to grow multiple crops a year. And so they're starting early.
Big light systems.
So they're like using big light systems within greenhouses. And so when those lights have to be on all the time to produce a flower or however that works, I'm not exactly sure. But when the lights come on at like 2 in the morning or 1 in the morning or whatever, and it's like, I mean, right? We usually turn our lights on at like 4 in the morning or whatever for them to initiate lighting in the wintertime. And just with 8 or 10 light bulbs, you know, yeah, it's you know,
So
it glows pretty good.
So that downlighting wouldn't address, you know, because if it's a building, I mean, you don't have to have windows to allow the light out, right?
Right, I mean, that's what I'm saying, is that downcast outdoor lighting is different than you know, lighting indoors.
And it may be something the commissioners can pick up. Part of the problem is how we define indoor grows. Some of them, for instance, one of the farms we went and looked at, their cans, they're not translucent, transparent, they're not transparent, like VisQueen. You know, they're tarp. And you may get some light leakage, but essentially it's a solid building with lights inside, as opposed to some, where it's what I would call VisQueen, the clear plastic with the lights blazing inside. Well, okay, fair enough, that probably looks like a supernova as
Or-
landed on the field, so.
Or even a building, an actual built building that has a lot of glass in it.
Lot of
to let in
windows.
Natural light to keep it warm and whatever, and all of a sudden you flip on the lights and,
No, fair enough. They didn't tear into that. So the language in their recommendation is the same as you currently have in your animal controls.
So you're basing that on something you see now?
absolutely, there is no, I went through our nuisance code, and we have a noise, we have a deal in there for noise, but we don't have anything for lighting.
Yep.
Yeah, my question was that, is that something you're seeing in a particular building
Yes,
today?
yep.
Okay.
That, well, call
We
it a
got a
dark,
comment on it,
some
so-
call it a dark sky ordinance.
Right.
It came up, one of the first iterations of.
Way back when.
Way back, one of the first iterations of the comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
Folks were looking for policy at the comprehensive planning level about dark sky protection, night sky
And-
protection. And, the commissioners,
This goes more to strictly to nuisance, like,
Well, and actually.
it's 2 o'clock in the morning and it's pitch black out, except for that my house is lit up like a Christmas tree because of my neighbor's, grow lights shining through the windows out.
So I'm inclined to, and I don't know if you agree with this, because you're looking at the nuisance ordinance for that, but having that as a nuisance thing, I don't know how close we get to dark sky ordinance. I mean, I'm willing to explore that, just because there's some other benefits to that, but to have it in the nuisance section, because I would like it applicable to all instead of just, one particular part of the industry. I mean,
Sort of, I mean, if it goes into the ordinance right now,
Uh-huh.
at least there's protection in there before we
For
have to
somebody
delve,
to get something.
well, before we have to delve
It's
in.
easier to deal with the nuisance ordinance than it is the zoning code, isn't it?
if you want something for general application, it should
Just
probably
right
be in
away.
your nuisance section, so it's generally applicable. If you put it in your
Is it
zone.
exempt, is it like the noise ordinance where it's exempt from or agriculture is exempt? What about people who have security lighting, how much security lighting can come on, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot, 1,000 questions.
Depends on how you craft your nuisance ordinance, you know, like your noise ordinance, it's,
Okay, so,
unique, I can't remember the language now, it'll come to me anyway, but unique to the time and place. So loud music in an industrial zone, violation of your zone code, or excuse me, noise would not be, so.
because we're talking about residential areas too, and, those kinds of nuisances occur outside of this stuff here. I see what you're talking about in terms of getting it in there now, and, I don't know what that causes for us in the timeline we have in place at the moment, but.
Well, let's talk about that. As a matter of practice, although I have not talked to you two about that, about this particular approach, we always, when we're working with code amendments or the adoption of new codes or anything of that nature, the book says the planning commission conducts the public hearings and sends their recommendation to you. If you just take their recommendation and adopt it, you don't have to conduct your own public hearing. However, past boards of county commissioners, and I haven't asked you, so you've been doing the same thing, you always set your own public hearing to take comments, irregardless of whether you just adopt what they send to you or not. The disadvantage to that is you have the time and the effort to actually conduct another public hearing, even though you might well adopt exactly what the planning commission sent you. The advantage is, if you wish to amend it, you have now set the process in place to do that. They've made their recommendation to you. Now, an approach we could take, if you want to, is I could put it in front of you, you can look at it, and if you are prepared to adopt it as they send it to you, you can just adopt enabling ordinances. If you look at it and say, yeah, we need to make some changes, then we set it for
That's what
public hearing, or you remand it back.
That's what we need to do.
Now what we have been doing is just automatically set a public hearing in front of you.
No.
Well, here's the double-edged sword in this case, and that is that one area, you know, you have a chance to fix something and move it on through the process. And the other is that the planning commission gave consideration of something, and had a conversation, and then they based their recommendation on something, and it's like, oh, some information that we don't have, or, you know, something along those lines. The other part of it is, though, is that, you know, we're talking about adding something that may or may not be, have been discussed. I think it was discussed with the planning commission, wasn't it, the lighting issue?
That pendulum's kind of swung back and forth a little bit. It did with the advisory committee.
Yeah.
We finally arrived at what you adopted as interim control.
Yeah, cause remanding it back isn't all that bad. It's like, would you please reconsider this? We're concerned about it. We're the ones getting the advice about these things. And, you know, would you take another look at it? I mean, I'm just looking at both sides of that, because, sometimes commissioners will change things that they didn't have the full story on either, you know? It concerns me. I like to respect the planning commission's work and the planning department's work.
But as far as process goes, why would we set, here, rhetorical question.
Right.
Why would I set a public hearing on something that I haven't even seen yet? And can't go, oh, wow, this actually does address the issues that I'm talking
Would
about.
it be a matter of policy?
Say we've had this with previous boards, had this discussion. And frankly, on the occasion they've asked me what I think, I usually recommend, and you've heard this before, I generally recommend the public hearing. If for no other reason, there's a fair number of folk out there that see no particular reason to go and talk to the planning commission. They're not their county commissioners. I'll go talk to my county commissioner when it's time to do that. So you do, not always, but you do sometimes get an entirely different mix of people that show up to your commissioner's public hearing than to the planning commission. But that said, the book doesn't require you to do that. If you're prepared to just adopt it, you could literally put it on the consent agenda.
Well, if you're gonna make changes to it, you should have a public hearing, right?
You have to, if you consider changes,
Right.
you have to conduct your own public hearing.
Right. I guess maybe that's the way it should go. I mean, if you're gonna make changes, have the public hearing. If you've read it, and you're gonna go forward, and don't have.
A way that we can approach it, and this was my previous life, right now staff, for the most part, set your public hearings. Clerk of the board and I coordinate, sometimes she coordinates with you on those occasions when that's a way to go. In my past life, we set all the public hearings. So staff would put in front of you, county commissioners, staff would put in front of you the issue with a draft public hearing notice, and that would be your opportunity to have looked at what came out of the planning commission. You can go, we're just gonna adopt it, you don't set the public hearing. Or conversely, nah, we need to talk about some of this stuff, so I wanna set a public hearing in case we wanna make changes. Now, we can set, at least with this sort of thing.
Hearings on a legislative action. And basically, it was because it was legislative, and we could talk to people in between the time that, the recommendation came out, clear up to the day you make the decision, you can talk to anybody about it, it's not wasn't official. So we always had, in anything I wrote, the second public hearing on legislative matters. How do you feel about it? I think it's a legislative decision, so, there's not all except that, you got a recommendation from the planning commission, and you're gonna hear again, maybe a different crowd.
The one you're worried about is if you start having a public hearing, instead of remanding it back to the planning commission.
It's not a change, we're gonna make, they have a public hearing. Good.
I would think that if I were to, in my mind, okay, if Perry were to hand me, hey, this is the recommendation for the planning commission. And I look at it and I go, yeah, this doesn't address a few things that some of my constituents said. But I don't want to keep usurping the planning commission's power by well, you didn't
Especially in the
recommend this,
recommendations.
you didn't recommend this, right? I'm gonna change it. And instead, me say, okay, look, these are a couple things that I don't see in here that some constituents said, that came up in the midst of this. I wanna remand it back to you and look at it and give us your recommendation. It comes back, and at least they've had a chance to address the issues that we've had. And then you could set it, and then maybe you could set a public hearing, I don't know.
Yeah, either
That's-
way, I mean, you still have that second hearing.
I guess I'm a little bit leery about,
Here's what I was, a scenario I was thinking about, and congrats what you're saying, is that you have a public hearing, you hear some other stuff that they didn't hear, and you remand it back.
Always an option. I mean, the commissioners can
do they have
conduct.
to have another public hearing then to make changes, though?
Well, I mean, there's a number of scenarios. Let's take all the potential scenarios. Comes to you, you look at it, perfect. Not gonna make any changes, not gonna talk about any changes. It goes on the consent agenda with an adopting ordinance, you're done.
Yeah.
You look at it and go, I don't know. There's a couple of sections here I think we need to talk about. You can't make changes or do anything but adopt it unless you set your own public hearing. So you set your public hearing, people come in and testify, you bat it around. You can either decide, okay, or you can just make the changes. Now, there's a line, it's a little blurry. If you make enough changes, you should go back out for public comment and set another hearing to talk about the,
The public didn't have the opportunity.
because they didn't have the opportunity to talk about those things, exactly. Or, if they're within the boundaries of what was proposed, or just tweaking, if you will, then you can just make your amendments and adopt your changes. So,
And that's where you gotta kind of be careful, because you could have that hearing at the planning commission, this is kind of convoluted in that hearing. Have things that weren't issued, or they weren't even there, and they call up and about it, and then you're gonna do something. You're gonna try to make the changes, you're gonna remand it, you're gonna do something, I would imagine. If it's substantive, I would think that, you'd want.
well, consistent with past practice, we've already set the hearing on this one, so it's coming. But what I can do is we'll put it back on the agenda, I'll bat it around, not this particular proposal, but the general world of legislative proposals, the ones that go to the planning commission, and that's all your land use controls. And maybe come up with a process you're more comfortable with.
I'm gonna, did they, we got the draft that they made additions about, correct?
Well, if you haven't, you will.
Okay.
Did we send that over already? No, but we have it, and it'll come to you.
Okay. So, but you've already set a public hearing?
I've already said, see, that's what we would normally do, is just go ahead and set the hearing, and then I would give you the materials and go at it. If you want to, and then that's just the habit on my part, because that's what all the previous have done. What we would do, if you want a more active role in determining whether it would go to public hearing or not, is we would send you the recommendation from the planning commission, along with a request to set a public hearing. You then look at it and go, yeah, I'm okay with all of
I
it.
would rather have it go that way,
Okay,
personally.
I mean, if that,
Now, that's not.
I don't understand, but I'm counting. I mean, the only real difference is you would get the materials up front, and then you can decide
Whether you said,
if you wanna set a public hearing or not.
that works.
And it doesn't really matter why you wanna set a public hearing, you either wanna make changes, or you think you're getting phone calls or whatever. That would be the only real difference, is we would essentially come up with a proposed public hearing date, and you would decide whether to do it or not. It only happens when we have these kind of code amendments, which isn't that frequent, so. So, we will go ahead and implement that if that be the desire of the board.
That's fine.
Okay.
It's one of those things too, where if it's something that, like a whole comprehensive plan, we got half the night, you're listening to one, and then you make a couple of, you said you're gonna set a hearing, make some changes. You can always say, we wanna limit our testimony to the testimony that we haven't heard.
Yep. there's latitude to do
There's,
that.
I went to a couple of hearings that, you couldn't, when you go through, yeah, and there was, I mean, it was Oroville High School, and, there was lots of testimony that was repetitive anyway. And then you said another public, a bunch of repetitive testimony that you're reading in the record, or you can read in the record. I would, I'd like to streamline that a bit, because I don't think that's necessary.
We go to horrendous efforts sometimes to get as much information as you possibly get.
Because,
So-
if somebody comes in and says that we're regulating how many or whether their cat has to live in the barn or not, and they say it 40 times, I don't wanna go through those kind of things. I think we can streamline that.
So how this will take shape, so you know what you're looking for, you'll have the code section out of the planning commission, public hearing notice, and for the agenda bill, the action will seek.
Recommended adoption motion.
Yep, that sort of thing. So, I sent it over quickly. Here's a hard copy. This is our grant application for the $60,000 for the well tracking system. You'll note the bulk of it is, of course, the temporary. We would hire some equipment, some overhead, fuel, that sort of thing. And I apologize, commissioners, although we've talked about this a dozen times, I should have done a grant application approval form, which is the protocol. So I'll get one of those put together in front of you. We haven't applied for anything yet.
Oh, okay.
This is a draft. It's gone to DOE.
I thought it was,
No.
there was a little retro there.
Well, little retro, because we haven't actually applied yet, so you're getting a preview on the application.
On that note about policy in terms of the authorization to apply for a grant,
About what, I'm sorry?
the authorization, I'm sorry, my voice obviously is going away. To apply for a grant,
Yes.
that approval, I was wondering how that policy looks. Is it in a written policy statement, or is it something that we've been doing just as in practice? And the reason I ask that question is because I know that on occasion you'll see a grant, you know that it's something you really need to do. You apply for that grant, and you haven't received authorization because of the time factor that you have. And what concerns me in that is that there should be some exceptions to that rule where you can come in and say, we applied for the grant. If you got the grant, you wouldn't have to accept it. It's just some grants all of a sudden come at you, and it's like, well, we didn't see this, but certainly the commissioners would like to see this money come into the county, and I know that in my planning department or what have you, and I make that application and come back for affirmation or some kind of a thing.
Fair enough. And then Laney probably has a better history of this than I know, but there was actually a form generated, a pre-grant application approval form, and then, as I recall the discussions, and some of them were actually before my time, the impetus behind that was folks applying for grants without any real, like, global consideration of the workload it puts on other departments.
exactly right,
You know,
yeah.
so while, I mean, to your point, you could, before you accept the grant, get to that, where that unhinged a little bit with some of the other elected officials and whatnot, who didn't necessarily believe it necessary to get approval to accept the money once approved. Anyway,
Okay. Well, just speaking to that policy, let's look at that, and if there's a way, especially when it's a department that's working, I mean, it's under us, it's close contact. Because I have had that situation happen to me before. Now, granted, it was like I was having a meeting every 2 weeks, and I'd have to wait 2 weeks, but, I'm sure there's occasion where you miss the grant application, and I would hate to see somebody not do work on the grant application, it's only a 2-page or 1-page application. And, we didn't get authorization to do that. Hey, we applied for this grant, would you like me to call the agency and withdraw it? They don't act that fast. It's something to think about in the
Understood,
future.
What, Commissioner's interested in revisiting this, with your indulgence, I'll collaborate with Laney on this. I say she's more knowledgeable on that particular discussion than I, and we'll come up with a recap of what got us to where we are today.
But I hear what
I
you
just-
say about the other.
Yeah, I just worry about departments being able to obligate funds without, prior approval.
You're not obligating them, no, so I hear what you're saying there too. I mean, I've been there a few times and I just, that's a policy issue outside of what we're doing now, so let's
So,
go forward. But
well-
I'd like to,
We'll drag out the policy in terms of what everyone's supposed to be doing, and
because there's gotta be room for some flexibility and exception. Well, if there isn't, you're gonna do it anyway and come in here and.
in this particular case, you will see the grant application pre-approval form before I hit the send button, to Vanessa. More to the point, run your thumb down and make sure that you think it's reflective of what we've been talking about trying to do with this money, so. Kind of tied to this, I went ahead and issued the notice for the staff position that's in my budget. So by the time we get around to getting the names and interviews and all of that, well, that should be just about right, for the money left in the year to cover the planner one position and benefit.
Good. So are you gonna hire in a so let's say that, and I think that's good tactics, hire in a person at that planner one position and then pay them for a year and a half based on this grant to do?
No, this is a separate discussion. The planner one position that I posted is the one that's in my budget already,
Okay, so you're hiring for another planner one?
for another planner one. You remember you cut back
I do.
part of that funding, so their go hot date would be mid-September in terms of to the end of the year, so. Then we'll go from there. The other position, the grant funded position, will also come in as a planner one. There's a little bit of method to my madness if I get a hiring list for the position in the budget, and some of them have the credentials, because they're all planner ones, to work into the temporary position, and they're willing to do that, then I may not have to repost. Your policies allow for that, so I might not be able to, but they will, of course, be on board for the duration of the money, June 30 of next year, and they're gone, so, unless we get more money or something else happens. So that notice is out, but just so you know, the notice that's out is for the regular one position. 49, we don't have the grant application process yet for the money there. I have put together, and we're starting to address and get ready to go, the letters to the different organizations, Kelp and Horticulture and Farm Bureau and all those guys, the cities. The notice for applications went in, it'll publish Wednesday. And I'm going to go down and talk to them, it's gonna publish twice, this Wednesday and a week from. Then I'm gonna talk about trying to get some kind of a quarter page ad or something to draw a little more attention to it. I also thought, with your indulgence, maybe I'd get a hold of the radio station and go and chat with them about it, just in terms of what's going on and what we're looking to do.
So, I got a call from, we had environmental organizations listed, we had Jerry Gillespie listed on that. And I got a call from Rick Gillespie, talking about that, he goes, we're an organization, and we would rather be listed as Columbiana, and that's what she wanted to represent. And I said, well, what is Columbiana today? Because it used to be a newspaper, but apparently it's an educational nonprofit.
No.
So I asked them to submit a letter that explains what the organization is. And that's what role that they would rather fulfill in the environmental organization. I had some discussion with you about her involvement in the, 2 watershed planning efforts for quite some time before. I had some concerns, because back then, more of a personal basis, but she told me back then that she's having trouble driving at night, and, it's meetings involved in it. And Rick said that if that Columbiana is an organization
Well, if we, I mean, the reason, of course, that name's carried through is there was some discussion about bringing at least some of the past one, and we've had this
Yes,
discussion.
yeah.
And she was so interested,
Yeah.
and that was how it was listed before.
Yeah, no, understood, he was pointing that out.
If in fact we morph that to Columbia Annex,
Columbiana, Columbiana.
How you spell-
Columbia,
Columbiana.
Columbia I got, how you spell the last?
NA, add NA to the end of.
Oh, Columbia, nah. Cool, okay. Now, I mean, if we follow the protocol we've established for everyone else, we would send them a letter and ask them to send their representative,
Right.
so.
I just, like I said before, we were gonna wade into this thing now, and that's what we're doing. It's not a perfect process.
So the ads are in, the letters are getting ready to go out, and, we're moving ahead with the work. I can roll through the rest of your agenda in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, that's fine. With the.
Oh, I thought you guys were talking about.
No, I actually asked Commissioner Dietro what time, I have an emergency contract, and I wanted to see at what time someplace closed, because I
Oh,
wanted to make sure
okay.
that we could
I
finish
thought
our
we-
business, and I could still get over there, which I think we could definitely do.
We can do this.
Okay.
And the Columbiana thing, is that, so you're wanting to,
We did with the real estate guy sitting in the back of the room,
Yeah.
you know, this kind of stuff.
The
comes up
shape,
and-
since we already, we identified groups that I would argue are environmental groups. We left that one kind of general, position open, cause that's how it was listed before. If we change, what I would suggest we do is just scratch off environmental group, put Columbiana on the
Right,
list.
because we have a specific to environmental group that's.
We have the other list, of-
Valley,
exactly, the list of
uh,
organizations, and then just treat them like an organization, if that be the will of the board.
And that's why I also said, send something that describes the organization so that we understand exactly what we have.
No, fair enough. So your comp plan meeting, Wednesday, 9 o'clock. We'll have the maps, and hopefully if things calm down, I'll have more narrative for you to consider. Lake Management District, the ballots are coming back. Nightly rentals, the license applications are coming in. Let's go back up to number 1 and talk about the CXT toilet construction grant. I'm not gonna get anything from the one fellow with the construction Neil's his name.
oh, with the
Hey.
Washington, is that with the highway?
Western,
Yeah.
anyway, I can't remember his title now, but anyway, yeah, I'm sorry, let me bring you two up to speed. We're talking Methow Trail, Mr. DeSalvo, and a grant he has to put, CXT toilet at one of the trailheads up there.
It's actually the Forest, or the Trails, or the Trails Road, help write a grant that the Forest Service got from the highway.
Federal Highway Administration.
Federal Highway Administration.
Okay.
But which is state, but the Forest Service can't put a building on somebody else's property, and it's state-owned property. So that means.
Shopping essentially for a sponsor, if
Yes,
you will.
just for the physical.
For the grant, so I thought I could get the materials before now, I'm not gonna get them for a couple weeks, according to Neil. So when I get them, we'll go over and see what's gonna be involved in making this happen. Apparently this is part of the funding, there's some other funding lines, I have to get a hold of, Jim and see what it's all about, but I went ahead and made the call, and then have that ball now rolling. And on the title insurance issue, we chatted a bit, Tanya was helping out.
And just so that these two know, there was
We're not buying 50 acres of orchard or something.
no. No, the trailhead up in Mazama where there was the RCO grant that came into play, but the property was not quite right, and so the county did a property swap with the landowner. To finish up RCO grant, RCO had told the cooperative,
finally, once I cleared my head and walked the whole thing, Tanya and I batted it around, they don't need anything from us. They wanted title insurance on the replacement property. That's the property that came to us from the other seller. So it would be, we need permission from the other seller to buy title insurance property to us, which would then satisfy the RCO's requirements. So moral of the story, Tanya's writing a letter up to Jim, walking him through all that stuff. Because before, he was always asking us for permission to, we weren't gonna buy it, but for him to buy us a title insurance policy. That wouldn't work, because our land went to Ms. Pope. So that's not the property RCO is interested in. They're interested in the property that came to us, the replacement property. So I think we have that all straightened out now. So we'll get that squared away. We can come back to this. Let me just introduce it. I did a little bit the other day. In a lot of our discussion, came up with the cannabis, came up with, of course, nightly rentals, and we morphed that into a business license. You have a requirement in your kennel section, and it's the only requirement under conditional use permits where you have to do an annual review, compliance review. Came up as a condition with the Volker wedding venue. And we may need to get Dave involved in it, because I may be off base, but that makes me very uncomfortable. The whole idea behind land use planning and permits are to determine what, if any, conditions are necessary for a particular activity to be in a particular area, should be on the general landscape, permitted activities in these zones, conditional use permits are conditional use permits. Once you've established compatibility, enforcement, compliance, if you prefer, should be a different
Right.
vehicle.
Whether or not the wedding venues can be in the area is different
That's
than whether or not the specific wedding venue carries out its business in the proper manner.
That's something else. And the shape, in my opinion, the shape that should take is your business license. So it's not, and the reason, the subtlety that I'm getting to is the annual review oftentimes takes the opportunity for the neighbors and whoever else didn't want it to begin with to come in and grab another bite of the apple. And that's not what it's all about. It's about the conditions that were imposed and their compliance with those. In the shape of nightly rentals, do you have your tax code? Do you have your whatever, all of the requirements for a place? If you do, you get your license. If you don't, you don't. You don't lose your permit per se. You just can't operate until you fix it, like a health permit.
Right, it doesn't change the fact that it's still.
Still a
land
permitted
use-
wedding venue.
That the land use activities are.
Well, we'll come back to this. You have a number, and we talked about it once before, you have a number of business licenses on the books that I'm not sure anybody pays any attention to, and you have a whole bunch of other things that don't require a business license. And when it came up under the banner of cannabis, my suggestion was don't put some kind of an annual review on this. If you believe, and it should be part of a more, to your point often made, should be part of a more global discussion, are we going to regulate business in the county? And if so, what's the proper vehicle to that? Not regulate what we consider, because of a point in time, a particularly troublesome business, and leave everybody. So, anyway, I'll bring it back up. We'll have a more general discussion about some of it. So.
We have a action item on the consent agenda tomorrow that I was concerned about. It's kind of similar in a way, and that has to do with the personal property tax thing that we've been addressing for the growers, marijuana growers. And I was thinking about that. We had a little bit of a discrepancy in the spreadsheet in terms of who is paying, what are they late paying for, what are they late doing? That's one of those issues that brought up.
I do apologize that I have to go.
I talked to you.
Hey, somebody duck out and see if Frank's still there. He wanted to.
Yeah, would you do that as a way
Yeah.
out, man? But anyway, I bring that up because it was one of those things where we're gonna shotgun blast that thing and send letters for everybody protesting or objecting to their renewal of their licenses before their licenses are due. And
What's on your agenda for tomorrow?
Well,
It's on the consent agenda.
it's on the consent agenda at the end of the day.
Letter, Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board rejecting renewal of marijuana licensing various entities.
And so.
The ones that the assessor was
Right.
referring to.
About the paying taxes on personal property.
Right. So you got some that just haven't filed their 2019 list of personal property.
Right.
And then you got some that will probably in arrears. I haven't looked at those specifically to see, but, our approach was to go ahead and send to the Cannabis Board objections to their renewing their businesses licenses on a broad scale. And I'm beginning to have some second thoughts of that, especially after I looked at, there was already an error in the spreadsheet anyway. Some of them were just listed because they were growers. And we got that squared away with the assessor. And then the second tier, if you will, I looked at was the 2019 list discrepancy. In other words, they were required, you're required in April to submit your new list or at least sign an affidavit saying the old list still applies of your personal property that you're taxed for. And some of them, there's a handful of them that list dealt with other personal property taxes. They may pay their personal property taxes before, or deal with the list before their license renewal is even due, before, they may pay it before it's due. They may pay it, and then so they will have already been on record. And so I wanted to reconsider that, so tomorrow.
Frank, did you have some?
Okay, but that, and actually, George Thornton's suggestion, the planning commission batted around a little bit
Yeah.
as they talked about 17A290,
Yeah,
whether to put some specific requirement in the code about them having to pay their personal property taxes.
everybody has to.
They chatted about it a bit. They asked, and I offered my suggestion that wasn't necessarily the best approach to take. Where do you draw that line? You have to pay your income tax, you have to pay child, you have to pay personal property. List all of these things that you should do as a responsible citizen. But is that really a zoning issue in the final analysis? Now, this is a different context to a point, but still, how many Rebel Auto shops exist out there where you're not paying personal property on the paint machines or,
And we don't have that, so we happen to have, for the marijuana growers, we happen to have the mechanism to say, hey, those guys, we have something. You don't have, do we have a business license even for the example that you used?
what's that, we don't, the only business license we have right now is now on nightly rentals.
Yeah, right, so that's. what I-
Auctioneers,
Yeah.
hawkers, billiard halls.
So
dance hall.
Nightly rentals is another one where, you're gonna have to go there and track whether they're paying their personal property or their property tax in general. And I kinda go, is that something separate? If you don't pay it, you got 3 years, I think 3 years, and so you're gonna incur some costs because you did pay. And in some ways, I think that's your business. I know that.
My concerns always grow anytime you direct your attention at some subset
That's what,
of business activity. And then the one that comes immediately to mind is nightly rentals. We have a business license for nightly rentals. We don't have a business license for bed and breakfast.
Right.
And the only difference between the two is with the bed and breakfast, they live there, and the nightly rentals, they don't.
Right.
Well, from the viewpoint of the sorts of things a business license regimen should enforce, that distinction is academic. But because of a subset of interest in nightly rentals in one part of the county, we have a business license regimen, to make sure that all gets done. We don't look at a myriad of other things, and it's just, there's a line in there, I can't draw a big bright one for you.
Right.
Eventually you gravitate over into kind of an arbitrary and capricious approach to regulation.
Well, one of those that, so if you were to respond, when we got the information from, liquor and cannabis, and we go, okay, take this business for its face value. And we go, okay. We go and say, do they pay their personal renters? Now, on a tavern, and I would suggest if we do that, it's the same process